really looked at the history of domestic reforms and home economics reforms that took place, sort of the rise of home economics, which at the time was called domestic science. A lot of people, when they think about first wave feminism, they think specifically about suffrage, and obviously that was a big aspect of first wave feminism, which is when women earned the vote. But there were also these other things that were going on that really had to do with radically revisioning how, women's role in the home. Basically, we had the rise of, female professionalism, women who were educated and wanted to think about the home in different ways, think about the home more professionally, and also apply science to the home. So this is obviously the progressive era was a time where we had a strong investment in science and rationalizing, industrializing things. So, first wave feminists were wanting to apply this to the home, and they thought maybe this will help, maybe this will help us to create, a deeper sense of equity in the home, or at least take women's roles more seriously, take this idea of domestic labor more seriously. So students were sort of immersed in this history of first wave feminist reform, and really looked at some primary texts written by first wave feminist reformers, and by reformers who were interested in also specifically African American laborers. But then what we've done since then is we've sort of plunged into literary text. And so students looked at all different kinds of literary genres, utopian fiction like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, ghost stories, experimental modernism, social realism, and all of these genres we sort of looked at through this lens of domestic service reform or domestic reforms. So the students spent a lot of time obviously looking backwards at this progressive era, but also looking at the ways these discourses, these reforms still remain very relevant, okay? And so we really found this to be the case when we were discussing Charlotte Perkins Gilman's famous utopian novel, Herland, which is, it's basically a science fiction novel, but it's all women's society. And basically, there's a lot of problems with the novel that, we're going to talk about today, and I don't want to step on too many students' ideas, but basically, it's a really exciting text in many ways, because it forces you to think about radically restructuring the spheres of domesticity, and rethinking divisions of labor, and just basically being imaginative and not taking the status quo, the way the world is set up to be just, this is given, right? This is what women do, this is what men do, this is the way labor has to be divided up into these atomized spheres where you have women doing this drudgery and men doing that. So basically, students then, for the remainder of the class, right now they're in the process of doing their final research project. So students are going to be doing a deep dive into one specific literary text, contextualizing the text, looking at historical documents, or also literary criticism, to think about a specific text in more detail. So basically, for the roundtable discussions, I'm asking each of the students that are on the panel to reflect on their reforms or their research, and but also kind of ask the specific question about the current state, right? What should domesticity, domestic labor, and social relations look like now, right? Based on what they learned in the progressive era, you know, and you know, what did they get wrong? What can we take away from those reimaginings? How would we do things differently? And so this is, you know, and that is obviously related to the theme of sustainability, and that, you know, I think a lot of us have found, I'm thinking about for myself, that the way that we think about and live domesticity is not very sustainable, right? Especially in terms of labor and childcare or care work. We're still very strained and unhappy with the way things are, right? So I want to hear what they have to say, and this is supposed to be focused on their ideas and their research. So I'm going to, it's my honor to introduce my students, and who are presenting synchronously today. I also have two students, Kimberly Davis and Ali Garenchen, who have submitted papers to the CAHSS website that you can access. They're linked there. And but I have three students here with me today who are going to present their research and talk freely about this idea of what domesticity and domestic labor, so, you know, labor relations should look like. And the order that we're going to do it in is this. So I'm gonna just introduce their names, and then I'm going to ask each of them to go after the previous one is finished. So the first person to go is going to be Randy Joe DeGrave. I'm sorry, I just asked and I forgot. Samantha Myers, and then Eileen Zirkle. So those are my three students who will be presenting, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. All right, without further ado, I'm going to mute and ask Randy Joe to go, and very excited to hear from them.
Hello, so I'm Randy Jo DeGrave, and the topic that I decided to write about was the entrapment of women and their identity and personality transgression through the progressive era and to now. And something that I touched up on is in the domestic household during the progressive era, you know, there's the entrapment of that, like they're isolated, they're always stuck at home, there's no freedom for them, you know, all the chores that they're doing, all the taking care of the kids, serving the husband, you know, which can lead to, you know, the mental illness of depression, suicide postpartum after having the child. And relating to that, like to now, you know, women have fought for their rights, for their work to be more valued, for them to do whatever they want to what a man can do. And looking at it now, like if you want to go work, you can go work, but if you make that decision now, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, you're more frowned upon at it. Like, oh, why would you do that? Why would you want to be a stay-at-home mom when you have all this other things that you have, all this availability that you can do? You can go to school, you can go work. And I don't think that's what the progressive era was teaching us. It was teaching us to value the work of what women were doing. And not only that, but nowadays, like with the whole universal health care, they're like, you can't, unless you're wealthy, you can't have a stable childcare system for you and your family. Someone has to stay home, and it's usually the mother who does have to stay home. So you're still kind of stuck in this, you know, ideal like woman being home and taking care of the kids kind of situation, but it's more of a independent thing. Yeah, so sorry, I lost my train of thought. But they're like looking at Germany, like for example, they have a universal healthcare system where if the mom wanted to eventually go back to work, she can, and she doesn't have to worry about the money situation or like having to worry about like being in debt with, you know, her hospital bill or anything like that. Whereas in the United States, there's a lot going on, and there's like a lot where you have to worry about where your kid's gonna go, who's gonna watch your kid, how you're gonna pay for it, and it just comes down to you're gonna have to stay home, like unless there's some way of paying for that child care system. So yeah, that is what I wanted to talk about.
Thank you so much, Randy Joe. So Obviously, we're going to come back to all of this and interweave these topics but now we'll ask Samantha to go.
Hi, I'm Samantha Myers, and my topic was related to the reliance on men for financial support, the fact that women weren't allowed to make their own money. So first wave feminists were able to identify and put forth the idea of a discrepancy in pay between men and women based on a patriarchal belief system enforced by Victorian ideals. In the Victorian era, men were able to hold a job by themselves and pay for their family's living expenses, and women were supposed to stay home and take care of the children, like Randy Joe pointed out earlier. So they loved to be able to brag about the fact that they could take care of their family, and it's just really fun. But so when women would stay home and do their work, they would do daily, weekly, and monthly scheduled tasks like cleaning and taking care of the kids. And they were not paid for their labor in the home. In fact, women were completely reliant on men for financial stability. And from being a daughter to being a wife, a woman was always in the reliance of one man or another. This is actually due to a bunch of laws that prevent women from owning property or having the ability to vote, which is where that whole suffrage part of the progressive era comes in. So through these means, men were able to control the entire political and public sphere of life, which would effectively silence women when it came to their rights and their well-beings and their ability to function in society. And that's one of the main causes for the financial reliance on men. They just were not able to function outside of that system. How that reflects on today, we have a little bit more ability to function outside of the home. Obviously, we have the right to vote and we have the right to work, but that was gained through war. So we don't really want to go back to that. I would say that we're not as financially dependent on men anymore, but there are still discrepancies in pay. A lot of women make less than men, so like 79 cents to the dollar for white women, and actually women of color are statistically proven to make even less than that, somewhere around 59 cents to a dollar. So I don't think that there's too much going on that we can't fix. I feel like the reliance of women's work in the home in the past has reflected what we still do today. Women do typically take care of their children and they stay home in order to do that. So they usually have to take time off of work, and that affects their pay as well. And that is one of the main arguments that men make when we talk about this today, is that women make less because they choose to stay home. But that doesn't necessarily have to be what we do. We can always have either gender or any gender stay home and take care of the kids if they would choose to. But I feel like the whole child care system in general is pretty messed up. And I'm not exactly sure how to fix it myself, but I'm sure that if we get a bunch of people together, we can figure it out. And that was my presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Samantha. Now, Eiley, would you like to share your ideas?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eiley. So these are all kind of interconnected in a sort of way. So I chose to focus on women's alienation in marriage. And the biggest thing that the first wave feminists started to realize was, you married young, and then pretty much your whole life was planned out. You were expected to tend to your husband, tend to your children, tend to the home. And women weren't involved in outside activities. They weren't working outside of the home. These were the things that they were expected to do. So women began to feel alienated and isolated from the world. And it's in the progressive era that we start seeing them really question, you know, what can I do more? How can I do more? How can I break out of this? And this is when we start to see women working outside of the home. And it was a taboo in society to see women that worked outside of the home. They were often considered or looked at in the sense of, well, why don't you want to tend to your children? Or, you know, it's wrong for you to want to work outside of the home. But these women were really longing for more, because they felt so alienated and isolated. And then in terms of today, we've certainly come a long way. Randy, Joe, and Samantha both touched on the idea of, if you work outside of the home, then who cares for your kids? Or if you work from home, then you're going to care for your kids. You know, women still have this fine line of, you can do that, but you still have to do this. You're still in some sort of way confined to this. We've certainly come a long way. We see now more than ever men that are stay-at-home fathers, or men that work from home or tend to the children, equaled roles in relationships. And then there's also the flip side of, you know, there's still that sense of abusive relationships where they think that the men in the relationship still hold the patriarchal power, and you're going to do as I said, you're going to do this, that, and that. And it's not as frequent, but we still have women that are alienated in their relationships, marriages, you know, whatever the situation is. And these are all topics I think that we've come such a far way, but there's always room to grow. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. For some reason, I think I'm frozen here. My camera. Okay. Thank you so much for reflecting on those key themes. Obviously, there's so much to be said, right, about this. I think both Eiley and Randy, Joe, really you seem to be focusing on the kind of psychological implications of the patriarchal division of labor, right? The sense of alienation, the sense of entrapment that the literary texts definitely bring out, right? And Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was a reformer as well as a fiction writer, right? She combined both of those things. She was really interested in bringing out those feelings, right? Showing the world that women weren't content with their roles, or with these limited roles that they had, right? They wanted to break free from this, as we talked about, the cult of true domesticity, right? Which was the 19th century ideal for middle class and upper class women, right? So we know that Charlotte Perkins Gilman and other first wave feminist reformers were really trying to break free from that, right? That institution. But the other thing I wanted to kind of come back to, and that's something that Samantha touched on, is that what they really wanted to do also is not just make women feel better, like individual women. They also wanted to change the structures, right? And they wanted to create a domestic sphere and a public sphere, right, that was more accommodating. And that comes back to this idea, that Randy Joe said about valuing domestic work, right? It wasn't, I think that's a myth of feminism, is that women think of domesticity as drudgery and wanted to just reject it and be like men, right? Be like, the traditional sort of patriarchal, appropriate the traditional patriarchal role, right? And first wave feminists, the kind of reforms that we looked at actually really challenged that myth, right? They were like, no, let's create boarding houses for women who wanted to work. Let's create elaborate childcare networks. Let's Talk about how to clean more efficiently. Let's make more time for women so that they can do things, right? They wanted to change the structures. They wanted to change the way, the processes, right? The larger systemic ways in which women's roles were constrained, right? And of course, that would have the psychological implications that you're talking about, right? Make women feel less alienated, give them more opportunities, diversify who they imagine themselves to be, right? But they wanted big change. They wanted these larger structural changes to take place. And part of that was earning the vote. That was a huge, right? Suffrage is a massive, right, shift. But they also wanted to create more sustainable domestic processes. And that had, they believed that they could do that, right? They believed that they could say, we got to talk about childcare. We have to talk about health care, right? So the questions are still there, right? We still have a lot of these kind of systemic gaps, right? We still don't have childcare for people that need it, right? We have a division of labor still, but it's not that because women feel necessarily called to be, right, in charge of this. You know, a lot of this, there's a disproportionate number of women who stay home, and it's not because they choose that or they elect that. And that's not to devalue that work, right? It's just that it's not a choice for a lot of women, right? For families, right? They can't afford childcare, or it's an unsustainable cost, right? Because so this it's a myth to think about women staying home because they're choosing to, right? That's a false notion of domesticity and the way that domestic labor operates. But so I want to just kind of come back to, you know, what do you think, like, to go back to Herland, when we were talking about Herland, do you think that we had a really great, you know, online discussion about Herland. We talked a lot about how there were a lot of good things about Herland, but then there were some disturbing aspects of Herland. Do you want to talk about that? Do any three of you want to talk about that? Like, first wave feminism had some good ideas, obviously, but there were also, we talked about eugenics, right? We talked about the ways class and racial hierarchies got kind of reinforced by first wave feminist reforms, and how certain reformers really challenged that. Does anyone want to speak to that, or did your research, you know, I know that many of you started to talk about intersectionality and things. Do you want to speak to that at all? Obviously, Samantha, you started to talk about that when you were talking about disparities, how, you know, there were, you know, disparities in race and ethnicity in terms of the gap in wage, the wage gap.
Yeah, so I'm actually doing a lot of research on eugenics. That's what I'm focusing my main research on for my paper.
Mm-hmm.
I found that eugenics was mostly just a way to justify racism and ableism. So in Herland, for example, all of the women who lived in Herland were fit and they worked well together. And I believe they said they were all light-skinned at one point. So that's, I mean, eugenics had like a really wide scope of people who believed in it. It was a super popular ideal. I think, who was it? Teddy Roosevelt actually made laws surrounding eugenics to castrate people or to sterilize them. So it would definitely make sense that it shows up in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's work, because it was such a popular ideal and it made a lot of sense to a lot of people. And it was a good way to justify not allowing others into society and to contribute in society as we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a disturbing thing when you're thinking about the fight for gender and you know, gender equality, that in some ways, you know, white women white women of a particular class wielded power through eugenics. So they, sort of tried to cash in on, their whiteness, right, by denigrating other women, right? And so we start to see disturbing notions of, of what domesticity should it look like, or what a mother is, right? So we had eugenic ideals and maternalist ideals that kind of converged, right? And so you had white women imagining themselves as kind of the nation's mother, right? And they wanted to kind of make people into their image, right? And so they were adopting nurturing ideologies, which we think is a good thing, right? We definitely needed some more of that, right? We needed more communalism, and we needed more nurturing ideologies to kind of counterbalance that patriarchal stuff. But they were also, imposing a eugenic model onto society. So it's a very disturbing kind of contradiction, right? Where domesticity, this nice fluffy thing, is being used to kind of justify imperialism and classism and racism and all these things. Okay, so it's a very problematic origin for attempting to revision domesticity. Again, we have really good challenges, like you were talking about, the challenge to the sexoeconomic relation, the notion that women, right, have to belong to men and be financially dependent upon men. She critiqued that. That's good, right? But let's take the eugenics out, right? You know what I mean? So I think you're right. Does anyone else want to speak to this idea of intersectionality that was such a huge piece of our course, right? Eiley, Randy, Joe, did you have anything else to add to that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I can speak. I don't know if this quite answers your question, but something that I found really interesting in the short story was when the three men.
Oh, her story, you mean? Or, I mean, Herland.
Yeah. Was when the three men went to Herland and they started they started learning about each other's cultures and ways of being, and both sides were just genuinely intrigued but also kind of shocked. When the three men were explaining their mainstream society, the women of Herland were like, really? That's how women function in your society? And granted, they exaggerated it a bit and tried to scare them a little bit, but these women were genuinely almost intimidated, scared. They were like, whoa, that's so different from what we're doing here. Why do you do that? Why do we do this? They started comparing their ideas, and then they came to not so much as a middle ground, but both sides started reflecting on, well, maybe we should do this and we should do that and not do this, vice versa. That was something I thought was very interesting throughout the short story, Herland.
Well, I think, Eiley, you're picking up on something really important, which is, obviously there was a critique of how women felt, individual women felt. But what you're getting at here is that these texts that we studied this semester, they also sought to change the roots, the ideological roots of society, and said, this is all constructed, right? Utopias reveal that. They're saying we can imagine something differently, right? We don't need to do things the way that we've always done it. We don't need to put this neutral male subject, patriarchal male subject, at the center of society, right? We don't need to cling to these notions of what a man is or what a woman is, or right, what a gender role is, right? We can totally reimagine that. We can reimagine what the domestic sphere looks like. We don't even need a domestic sphere, right? Herland doesn't even really have a domestic sphere, right? These things are constructed, The domestic sphere is constructed, the public sphere is constructed. And in some ways, what first wave feminists wanted to do was dismantle the spheres completely, which is something we talked about, the separate spheres. They wanted to wipe it all out, right? And say, let's just start with a blank slate and let people be people, right? Yet they also had eugenic ideals, right? They subverted the cult of true domesticity and that ideal of true womanhood and replaced it with a eugenic, athletic, able-bodied white woman, right? So, that's the problem. And are we that far from that? How do we imagine feminine perfection in our society? Have we really gotten that far from that kind of eugenic ideal that is imagined in her land? It's still very hegemonic. What people are supposed to look like, what people are supposed to do, what a woman is supposed to be, right? What kind of a mother she's supposed to be. We don't have a communalist ethic when it comes to domesticity, right? We still cling to a lot of the separate spheres ideologies that we, the first wave feminists were challenging at the turn of the 20th century. Samantha or, Randy Joe, do you want to add to that?
Something else that I vividly remember in Herland was one of the girls asking one of the men when they come into Herland about his religion, and he started explaining to him and about the dominant power that they hold over the women, and how I think I remember how one of the men talked about, like, if you're not baptized, you're automatically going to hell, and you're like, that's just how it is. That's how it works. And in Herland, I remember them talking about like how women are respectful to women, and it's just about the love that they have on there. And so they were surprised how like you have to worship something that you don't even know what you're worshiping, and it's just something that you have to follow, otherwise you're just frowned upon it.
Yeah, I think that was one very good aspect of Herland, where they try to, that's the goal, is to challenge hierarchical relationships, right? Is that, look, everyone's on the same common ground. It's radical democracy, but at the same time, it's harmonized, right? And so it has a communal ethic as opposed to a competitive ethic, is what I think you're pointing out, Randy Joe. And those are the good things about Herland, right? But the problem is, of course, that a lot of times that communal ethic is covering up other things, right? It's covering up, other aspects that were not really, somebody had to clean toilets in Herland, right? Who made these decisions to sort of whittle out certain kinds of women from Herland? That's a top-down decision, right? And so it's a false sense of harmony that we see in Herland, right? To some extent, since we know about the other things that Gilman believed, and the other kinds of women that she, kind of scoffed at. So, Samantha, do you want to just have a last word before we maybe ask some people in our audience to ask some questions? Or do you feel comfortable saying anything now, or would you like to wait for a question?
I'm good to wait for some questions.
Okay. All right, well, can I open up the chat box for whomever is present that would like to pose a question for our panelists? I assume that there's somebody here because I see 12 participants on the thing, but oh, Professor Cohen, great work. What did you all learn in your research that most surprised you? Great question.
I mean, I wouldn't really say I was surprised by much of this because I had a lot of general knowledge before I had taken this class, but something that I would say more like helped my knowledge was the readings, like with Charlotte Gilman. I knew a lot of her work, but I didn't know like anything about her. And I think after finding out what she believed and what she fought for, it really like helped me and understand like what women really did believe during the progressive era. And this really helped me with my research.
Yeah, I think, thank you for saying that. I think coupling Gilman's non-literary work with her literary work is really illuminating, right? You can read The Yellow Wallpaper and just read it as a Gothic story, right? Which it is, but then when you learn about the kinds of reforms that she took, that she was engaged in, that's really helpful, I think. She was really, really critical of the fact that women were restricted to the home, right? She was critical of women's financial dependence on men. She was frustrated with the imposed domestic roles that they had. So I think that pairing is really helpful. Okay, thank you. We have another question. Great panel. Do the students see any role models today who provide a modern, more equitable ideal of how to balance domestic and wage labor? That's a really great question. Thank you, Professor Riley.
I would say that countries who have a universal healthcare system are probably the most ideal, because they do have that sort of, like built in, we can help you and you're not going to go into crazy debt and you're not going to be isolated from the world, because they don't bill you up for having a child, and they allow paid time off for women who have just become mothers. And I think they do the same for men. So I would say that the most ideal we can get is probably a universal healthcare system. I don't know how we would ever get that implemented here. I hope we do, but I don't know.
Yeah, I agree, Samantha. It's the role model is really it's got to be the national, right? State, at the state level, absolutely restructure society and put money in, put communal value on this. Does anyone else want to respond to that question specifically, or can we can look on to I'm sorry, Sarah. How has this course changed your views prior to the course? So does anyone feel like the course changed how they viewed maybe feminism or this era or literature or anything like that, or how it did? Hopefully it did to some extent, right?
I'll speak on this one. I think that it didn't necessarily change my view, because I knew, first wave feminists, they started breaking out of these molds and really set the basis for what our society is today. But I definitely would say that this course has broadened my views. Just in terms of, like, I was always, each week I was excited to do all of the readings. I was excited to do all the discussions. These were all topics that really make you sit and ruminate on what the authors had to say. They pose different issues that really made me, and still today, I sit back and think, wow, I'm so sorry, my dog is barking if you can hear.
Don't worry.
But I still sit back and think, you know, wow, this author really highlighted this issue, and what were these women feeling and experiencing that they push this movement so that I can live how I'm living today. That's how I kind of viewed this course. And it's definitely broadened my horizons on a lot of the topics. So.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to, Professor Nesbitt has a really great question here. And it's something that I think that we should talk more about. So we did talk about this pressure to stay at home, and obviously as we know, the cult of true domesticity was very much a privileged position. One of the things we talked a lot about, is particularly when we read African American authors, was how the cult of true domesticity was in many ways something reserved for white women, right? And white women of a particular class. So can we say more about that? Some of you, I believe, or I can't remember, or do we talk about the arrogant beggar? I mean, we talked a lot about the arrogant beggar in that particular text, and then we read, authors, all of the Harlem Renaissance authors that we read. Do what was, say more about their experience, basically.
So I'm doing my research on eugenics also through the sphere of arrogant beggar. I would say that the main character.
For people who don't know, Ansia Yezierska was an immigrant author of Jewish. She was a Jewish immigrant author, and Arrogant Beggar was one of the novels that we read.
Okay. So that novel, the main character, Adele, she is also an immigrant in the entire sphere of things. I believe her parents immigrated and she moved with them when she was very young. And they both died when she was very young in this new country all by herself. So she got by on a lot of help from other people for a while, and she was able to be self-sufficient on her own, which is incredibly, that's an accomplishment for sure, because she was, I think, 16, 17 at the time the novel was set. So, well, the main character, sorry, Adele was very young. And she always wanted more. She always wanted to get back to what her parents were doing. Her father loved music and she wanted to be a part of that. But she also just kind of wanted what she didn't necessarily have. So a lot of the white women who started boarding houses and first wave feminists who learned about eugenics had a lot of influence over her life. She tried to get into a women's home and she was successful in that. And they tried to teach her about the domestic sphere, and they tried to explain how the scientific evolution of domestic labor worked. And they wanted to teach her how to better do domestic labor, because they never thought that she was able to get outside of her own class, which was her entire goal. And she believed that these women would help her. I would say that the first wave feminists who believed in eugenics and who believed in this domestic reform, they had good intentions, and they were definitely helpful in the aspect that they provided women a place to live and they helped them achieve different jobs, but they never wanted them to be outside of their class. So I would say, for sure, immigrant women, they weren't necessarily a fan of going out to work all the time, but they weren't necessarily opposed to it either. They wanted to make something for themselves.
Also, they didn't have a choice, right? And I think that's part of the issue, is that they had to be a breadwinner, right? They had to contribute to the household. This isn't to say that many immigrant women didn't get kind of, once they, upon marriage, kind of brought back into the home and, you know, enlisted to do that work. But I think what you're picking up on is really important, right? Is that we had boarding houses, we had different training schools set up that reinforced a class hierarchy, and also built into that a race and ethnicity, a hierarchy with race and ethnicity. And they were essentially training schools, like training women to be servants in the home for, right, women of upper class. So that's a very different experience with domesticity. And, you know, the mistress servant, employer servant dynamic was a strong theme throughout the class, examining that power dynamic between women, between classes of women. Does anyone else want to speak to that? Other panelists want to respond to that particular question?
Excuse me. Something that I remembered, like, wanted to talk about was one of the novels, The Street by Anne Petrie.
Anne Petrie.
That's right. And about Ludi, how her and her son are stuck in Harlem, and she wants to get out, and she has like this big, she believes in the American dream and how if she's gonna work hard, she will be successful and she'll get out, and she has all these plans with her and her kid. And then when she finally gets out and she starts working, it's not how it's working, especially for an African American woman. You know, she ends up going to the casino to sing, and after a couple of times working, Boots won't pay her because she needs more experience, which is just another excuse not to pay her. And she's starting to realize, like, it's not helping me. She's not going to be able to get out. She's going to have to, like, work harder. She's going to have to find some way to pay for her apartment, for her kid, for everything. And when she realized she's going to be stuck in Harlem for probably the rest of her life, she realized, like, there's no way of getting out. And that goes along with this entrapment of women and during the Progressive era, and of African American women. You know, like, they might not be stuck in the domestic household, but they're stuck in this low income society where they're not getting paid, and there's no way of them getting out.
They're doing other people's domestic work on top of their own, right? Good point, Randy Joe. Yeah, that's the culminating novel of the course, is The Street. And, you know, if you think about it, you know, her whole goal is to get off the street and to have a safe, comfortable home, right? So this idea of domestic entrapment is ironic when we think about that in relation to the street, right? Because the goal is to kind of, wow, I wish I could stay home with my son and keep him safe, right? And, you know, so it kind of inverts everything that Charlotte Perkins Gilman talks about. So thank you so much, everyone, for these great questions. And, you know, I think we've come to a close here, and I really appreciate everyone who posed questions, and my students who just did a fabulous job talking about their work. Thank you so much for coming out today. I hope you had a good experience, and I look forward to reading your full-length research papers on these topics. Okay? All right. Well, I think we can just sign out, and then